of A is in a position to acquire knowledge to the effect that S produced M. 2, it is reasonable for S to expect that no one among the members of A will come to know something to this effect. And 3, the explanation for both of the foregoing is that S's identity, co-producer of M, is in some way hidden from members of A. Now, with this characterization of anonymity, the most obvious kind of anonymity that we can find in this is intentional anonymity, where the speaker expects that no one from the audience, from our hearers, will identify or attach an identity to her as the speaker of the testimony. However, there are other instances where there can be the case where the speaker's identity is hidden from the audience, and it is not intentional. In other words, we can have intentional anonymity and unintentional anonymity. So intentional anonymity will speak to cases where the speaker deliberately hides his or her identity for whatever reason, for privacy, for protection, or for mischief, for crime. But the basic thing in these kinds of anonymity is that the speaker's identity is hidden. And so I tried to conceive of an instance of anonymity where we do not have to identify. Maybe a speaker intentionally hides his identity or not, because there are instances where due to long chains of communication or complex webs of interaction, a speaker's identity may get lost in interaction, such as in oral tradition or oral history. This could even occur in stranger testimony, where you're driving down the street, you're heading to, say, a barber shop or something, and then you ask for directions from the stranger, and then in few seconds, the stranger gives you directions and goes away. And then you are not able to recall, or you are not able to attach any sort of character that identifies or traits that identifies that stranger that gave you that direction, that testimony. And in such cases, it was not the intention, perhaps, it was not the intention of the stranger to be anonymous to you. So anonymity can also be unintentional. But where I narrowed it down to two is that at the instance where the hearer is to make an epistemic decision regarding P, and S is anonymous, then we have basic anonymity. That is, when I receive a testimony whose speaker I cannot identify and I cannot trace. The speaker is untraceable and not unidentifiable, then the speaker is anonymous to me, basically, at that point in time. And so when this kind of situation occurs, what do I do? How do I engage with the testimony? What do I do with the testimony? How do I engage with the testimony in such a way that I can identify if there is an injustice in such situations? So how can a hearer of anonymous testimony engage in testimonial injustice? Now, a lot has been said about Africa's standard requirements for testimony. So I quickly list out 3 main points that that follows in my presentation. The first is that there's a credibility assessment for the speaker. And this credibility assessment is influenced by prejudice from the hearer. The second is that credibility deficit is accrued to the speaker in the hearer's assessment. And then there is harm to a speaker, to the speaker in a capacity as a knower. And so I make a very little revision on the third point, harm to a speaker in a capacity as a knower. This is because there are instances where we have passive participants in interactions. We have passive participants. Although I do not go into that in this presentation, in some other presentations, I identified some people as being secondary speakers in the chain of communication, and those are like passive participants in the chain of communication. And so I revised this third point to say that there is harm to any speaker in a capacity as a knower. In other words, when we identify any speaker not just perhaps we could say an agent, but any speaker that stands, any agent that stands in the position of the speaker, if there is harm to such a person, then testimonial injustice occurs. And so then I go to ask some fundamental questions if we are to answer the question, or if we are to look at how testimonial injustice occurs in an anonymous testimony. So is there credibility? Can there be a credibility assessment of an anonymous speaker, given that the speaker is unidentifiable, the speaker, there is no character, there is no trait to coordinate any kind of identity to such a speaker? And then can harm be done to an anonymous speaker? And so in order to examine these questions, I quickly give 3 cases. Now, the first case is about someone, Brenda, who gets to her door. On getting to her door, she finds a note addressed to her, not signed by anyone, that tells her that her partner is cheating. And she believes it is from Felly, one of her friends who has often shown reservations about her friendship. And 2 things comes out from here. The first is that there's a credibility assessment of someone. And the second is that Brenda has put a check on proper belief formation as it regards the notes, the content of the notes. Now, credibility assessment here is not targeted at the anonymous speaker because there is no information at all about the anonymous speaker. There is no indication of who the anonymous speaker is. But Brenda puts someone, assigns someone that identity in this particular case, and then she makes a belief judgment that is not related to the content of the anonymous assertion itself. In other words, Brenda forces a relationship of social interaction between herself, the note, and then an assumed speaker. Now, quickly, I go to the second case. Brenda's case gives us a situation of restricted epistemic domain, wherefore how she forms her belief stands within a restricted domain of herself, her partner, and then her friend. Then I go to another case of someone who goes to a brother who is on a broader epistemic domain, that is study, who visits an anonymous blog online, and on that blog finds a story that describes sexist attitudes of male academics towards female colleagues. The setting of the story appears very familiar to him. He believes that this could have only been written by Brad, because Brad has always been a colleague who has been outspoken on such matters. And just like Brenda has done, Tade gives an identity, assigns an identity to an assumed speaker of the anonymous content and abandons the content itself in the process of belief formation. And so there is a problem of moving from the content of the anonymous testimony to believing that there is a person who is responsible for authoring the anonymous testimony. And then the third case is that Nate walks around the park with his child. He sees a note conspicuously placed where people can see that says there's a wandering pedophile around this particular park. He believes this has been written by Jay, who has often been caught in the random acts of dropping notes around the park. Just as case 1 and 2, Nate assigns an identity on Jay as being the speaker or the author of the anonymous notes, and then abandons the very content of the belief that attention should be placed on. Now, the difference between all of these 3 cases is basically the epistemic domains, and there are some other implications in the cases that I do not talk about here. However, the overarching claim on these 3 cases is that a credibility assessment occurs, and then there is a way in which this credibility assessment harms the assumed speakers. And that is why I made a revision on Lackey's standard of testimonial justice to say that testimonial injustice can occur as harm to any speaker in a capacity as a knower. Now, how come that all these 3 hearers arrive at identifying an assumed speaker? Now, just as Frika said that we have the power of social imagination when we are making credibility assessments. And then the role of background beliefs helps us to arrive at some conclusions. Those conclusions may not be appropriate, but background beliefs, background evidence may help us, may tend towards some conclusions that we hold at the end of the day. And so I conceive of these instances as involving nascent testimonial injustice. That is a kind of testimonial injustice that a hearer commits by making a credibility assessment of a person S with an assumption that S is a source of P, and this in turn influences the hearer's attitude to P. And so two things comes out of here. One is making a misplaced credibility assessment, and two is the abandonment of the hearer's responsibility in appropriate belief formation. So in these instances, the assumed speaker is admitted as a passive participant in the interaction. And being a passive participant in the interaction makes the assumed speaker less of an agent. And it is akin to what Miriam Africa calls epistemic objectification of the speaker. Now, epistemic objectification of this speaker makes her less of a participant in such a way that there is no direct, there is no active relation, there is no intention of the speaker either to be part of that social interaction, that testimonial interaction, or the intention that is expected of a speaker in a testimonial interaction. And so objectifying the assumed speaker, treating the assumed speaker as a basis of which to make, from which an inference can be made, objectifies that speaker and causes harm to that speaker. Now, it is another case if we are to interrogate if the assumed speaker knows that he has been objectified in that instance or not, or perhaps that the assumed speaker is even truly the source, the original source of that testimony. That would be a different question entirely, because then this could be as a result of epistemic law, or just lucky guessing on the part of the hearer to say, oh, this must have been the person, or this is the person who wrote this. So making a credibility judgment of an assumed anonymous speaker is not merely a problem of imagined social interaction. Why is this so? This is because when there is misplaced credibility assessment, it will yield a process of belief formation that is faulty. It will yield a process of belief formation that abandons the responsibility of the hearer as an autonomous agent in that interaction. And this will ultimately affect the epistemic community in which that information will possibly be circulated. So assuming that Nate has the information that there is a wandering pedophile around the park. Now there's a stake there's something at stake in that community, which is harm, practical harm to children in that community, and by extension, their parents and all that. And now Nate forms a belief that J is the source of that information. Now let's even assume that J is also a part of that community. It will be, in a way, how Nate will pass across that message will not just depend on Nate receiving that testimony as anonymous testimony, but alongside his belief that J is the author of that note. And when this happens, assuming he goes to neighbor one and tells neighbor one, I found a note in the park, it says there's a wandering pedophile around, but I believe it is J. So it creates an obstruction in the flow of information. It is different from Nate saying, I found a note in the park. I don't know who wrote it, but I know what I saw. The content of the note says there's a wandering pedophile around the park. Now, saying that to the neighbor is different from saying, I know, I found a note in the park. It says there's a pedophile wandering around, and I believe it is J. Because J already has a reputation in the environment that it drops random notes all around for mischief and all that. So it elicits a different kind of attitude in how the information is passed around. So this misplaced credibility assessment can also be described in a way as what Fricka calls a preemptive testimonial injustice. While preemptive testimonial injustice describes the situation where a hearer attributes the credibility deficit in advance of the testimonial exchange, nascent testimonial injustice preempts the identity of an assumed speaker and the participation of that speaker in the act of communication. So it's while the act of communication occurs without the relation of the speaker, the hearer brings in an identity that is not even solicited for, so to speak, to try to find a means of making a credibility assessment. Because one of the things that the presence of the speaker does in interaction is for us to find more ways, or more, we depend on the presence of the speaker in making belief formation, in our belief formation, in trying to arrive at a responsible belief. And so when that is cut off in the instance of anonymous testimony, the hearer depends only on herself to arrive at the belief formation. Now, believing the information or not believing the information is open to arguments. If the note is true, if the note is not true, if the anonymous blog was right, if the story was right or not, is another thing. But the belief formation, the responsibility of the hearer is that proper belief formation must be carried out in trying to arrive at a testimonial belief. So testimonial injustice generally damages the epistemic system. It creates an obstruction to responsible believing and can create an obstruction to the circulation of ideas in an appropriate manner, impossible sharing and retransmitting of anonymous content. And okay, this is in a way applicable to online sharing of information and transmitting of information, where there are cross postings of content online, anonymous content online. Some content online even start off as not being anonymous, but in the event of cross postings, it becomes anonymous, and then the identity of the source is lost. But one thing is important: sharing must be done in a responsible manner, because sharing an anonymous information puts the hearer not in the position of the original speaker, but as a responsible epistemic agent in the epistemic system to do that which is virtuous, to preserve the epistemic system. And so a hearer of anonymous testimony should avoid the abandonment of the context of interaction, that is anonymity, informing testimonial beliefs reasonably and responsibly. And in doing that, credibility assessment should only be applied to cases of identified speakers and not assumed speakers. And then attention must be put on the content of anonymous testimony and not on any assumed speaker. Yeah, that is all I have right now. Yes. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Share.